All right, guys. This is Dr. Surasingha now with the tree competition lab. So after this lab, we only actually have just a few more things to complete on the simulation activities. So, and those labs, the simulation, the SimBio lab, or these computer simulation labs are pretty easy and fun. I hope you guys are enjoying those. I would like to hear from you guys regarding how you are enjoying those labs. They are self-paced, and I really enjoyed it when I practiced before giving it to you. So that aside, this is actually kind of the only lab where I have to direct you towards for the completion of the data sheets and analysis. And so the tree competition lab includes measuring competition, right? So before understanding how to measure and assess competition, I want you to understand the species that we are going to study, right? That's the number one thing. Like we are going to study conifers and deciduous, right? So we are going to focus our study on conifers, and one of the most common coniferous trees in the southern New England, in the coastal southern New England, that is white pine, and then we are actually comparing them with other white pines and with um, the hardwood trees. Now, conifers are also called softwood because actually their wood is relatively softer in terms of the sturdiness. Now, do not make any do not think that softwood is weak, right? They are actually heavily used for construction purposes, um, and so conifers, softwood means the same, and pine is actually a white pine is only one type of softwood slash conifers, right? The other variety is deciduous, right? Now you know that conifers are evergreen, right? Now just to like not to mess with your brain, all conifers are evergreen, right? But not all evergreens are conifers, right? That's actually kind of a fun thing to know. Now, deciduous trees, all deciduous trees, are all deciduous trees hardwood? Not necessarily, but are all hardwood deciduous? Yes, right? So, and deciduous trees actually shed their leaves, they change color and then they shed their leaves, right? And their wood is actually relatively harder in terms of um, robustness and strength compared to conifers, right? So for this rest of the lab activity in your lab chapter, you will actually see the name hardwood and deciduous being used interchangeably. That's okay, but understand that all hardwoods are deciduous, but not all deciduous are hardwood, right? Um, because there could be certain herbs and certain soft-stemmed um, herbaceous vegetation that are actually deciduous, but they don't belong to the hardwood category, right? Um, and so the deciduous trees, they have broad leaves, right? And actually because of that you can actually in certain um, textbooks, in certain literature, the forest biome in our area is called broad-leaved hardwood, right? Or broad-leaved deciduous hardwood, right? So they have flat broad leaves, and then they drop and change color and drop seasonally. In contrast, conifers have small needle-like leaves, and then they retain their leaves year around. So in this slide, you actually see on this side, these are actually an example for hardwood slash deciduous, right? You're looking at actually red maple, sorry, sugar maple. Red maple will have a much more brighter red petiole and the leaf shape is quite different, right? And to this side, you are looking at an example for pine, right? White pine. In fact, white pine is one of the most dominant pine in our area. Sugar maple is among one of the most dominant trees in our area. So this is actually our study site. If we were to really do this, I would have taken you to the Carver Pond, and this particular map shows the location of the Carver Pond. This is the Summer Street. So what we do is we drive along the Summer Street. We come from here. Bridgewater is around somewhere around here, um, and then we drive down Summer Street, and when we do come from Bridgewater, Carver Pond is to your right side, and you park over here, and then you walk on this side of the lake, right? This huge yellow circle indicates the area that we usually study for this activity. One of the activities in your lab worksheet um, requires you to make a map. Since you have to make a map, I have actually provided coordinates in two different forms, in degrees, decimal degrees, minutes, and seconds over here and over there in decimal degrees, right? And so this is actually kind of an uglier map that I made, but your map should be better than this. And you have done this twice already, so I'm not going to go over how to make a map. Um, and so what usually you would have done is actually, you have gone with me, had a great time over there, and collected data. But we will not be doing that. Instead, I'm going to give you data. So in order to make this lab more meaningful, I'm going to take some time and explain you how the data was collected. In fact, I'm going to give you the data collected by our previous students in previous years. Okay. So we divide you into 3 to 4 groups, and each group randomly picks a focal pine tree, a white pine tree, right? And then what you do is you immediately measure the circumference at breast height of the focal tree, of the focal pine tree, and then for that particular focal pine tree, you find the nearest pine tree neighbor, right? And then also find the nearest hardwood tree, right? And then for both of those hardwood and the pine tree, that is the nearest neighbor to our focal pine, you measure circumference at breast height, CBH, and also you measure the distance between our focal pine to the distance to the nearest pine neighbor and the distance to the nearest hardwood neighbor. Okay, remember to measure everything in the same unit, in centimeters. Okay, mm, well, you are not taking measurements, but when you look at the data, know that all of those are measured in centimeters. And now you will do this, well, or you would have done this for 15 different pine trees, right? um and ultimately, with all the groups doing it, we compile the data, and I'm going to give you this compiled data set. Okay, so remember, we have the data collected for you. You don't have to go out there and collect the data, right? And then we actually enter the data, the students enter the data, and you don't have to enter the data either. It's already entered for you. And ultimately, we calculate for the circumference at breast height, we calculate the diameter um, at breast height. And you know the formula, right? D equals C divided by pi. D is diameter equals C circumference divided by 3.1444, right? Um, well, that's the very simply, that's the method we involve. This is used to be a very fun activity to do in the field. So this is how you measure the circumference at breast height. This is what we would have done, and this is what we did to collect the data that you see over here, right? And kind of to give you some sort of a glimpse of how complicated measuring DVH could be. You would think it's very simple and straightforward almost all the time, yes, but there are a few instances you have to be mindful of what you do. Yes, so mostly um, your breast height is about 4.5 feet from the ground, and then in fact we say breast height because it's easier to measure that. Otherwise, you'll have to actually measure the distance from the height from the ground. If you're accurately doing this, I would not judge by my own breast height. I will go by the actual height of the tree, right? And this is how you normally do it, right? You measure 4.5 feet from the ground, and you measure the diameter across, and see that the diameter you measure is parallel to the ground, right? Little complicated things. Sometimes the tree might bifork, split into two trunks at a distance shorter than 4.5 feet from the ground. In that case, you measure somewhat immediately below the forking point, right? So you measure the trunk before the tree splits into two trunks, right? And then, well, sometimes you get trees that are actually not on a slope, but the tree itself is slanting. In that case, you have to measure the, the diameter at an angle like this. Okay, in this case actually the diameter axis should be perpendicular to the axis that you measure from the ground. Okay, um, and sometimes trees grows on slopes, right? And if the trees are going on slope, again you have to make sure that the diameter is straight. You don't slope the diameter, right? Although the ground is on slope. Okay, and sometimes you actually get this weird type of trees where the single tree comprises of multiple stems that branches off right at the ground level. So in that case, you measure 4.5 feet from the ground vertically and then measure multiple stems and sum it up, right? You don't wrap a diameter tape around all of them. No, you individually measure each stem and then sum them up. It's kind of good to know the complexities that you arise when you try to assess the structural diversity of a particular woodland, right? And you might also wonder who the fuck measures this kind of thing. Like, what the hell? This You might think this is very childish. Well, actually, it's not. Right? In the forestry industry, it's one of the most nature-based businesses in the country, in the world. You need to measure this so that you know a particular tree is actually at a harvestable level, right? And also in the forestry sector, in the wildlife sector, we need to understand the maturity of the trees. So diameter at breast height actually tells us a lot about the tree's maturity, tree's size, tree's age, its overall above ground biomass, and also tells us a lot about the structural diversity of that particular forest. So it's actually, tells us a lot of useful information. Um, Now, just to illustrate what we are doing over here, here's your focal pine tree you randomly picked out of many, right? And then there are several pines around it, right? And there are several hardwoods around it, right? And this appears to be the pine that is of the closest distance to the focal pine. So you measure the interpine distance, right? Distance between the two individual trees of the same species. And then that hardwood seemed to be the closest to our focal pine. So this is the interspecific distance, right? Distance between two individuals of two different species, right? So that's another measurement you make. So there are actually five measurements you make, right? The circumference around focal tree, circumference around the nearest neighbor pine, circumference of the nearest neighbor hardwood, the distance between the focal pine and another pine, distance between the focal pine and the nearest hardwood. And again, you don't do this, but you need to understand how this was done. Now let's talk about computation, right? The computation can be divided into two, right? Interspecific, intraspecific. We are looking into both forms of computation here. The competition for resources between members of different species is interspecific between two different species. Intraspecific is competition for a common resource between two individuals of the same species, right? That is intraspecific competition, right? Now, this image kind of gives you the idea that competition always involves physical combat. Sometimes it does, particularly for animals. In the plants that we study, competition is not obviously physical. It actually happens kind of in other different ways. When you study competition in your lecture, you will actually learn more in detail about how the mechanisms trees compete. Um, Now, just to again illustrate some of the basic theoretical background to this regard, so definition of inter and interspecific competition. Interspecific is the competition for food and other critical biological needs between two individuals of the same species, two individuals of the two different species. And in fact, interspecific competition can happen between more than two species, right? It could happen between three species, four species. And in fact, when multiple species compete, we actually call it diffuse competition, since the actual interactions are very, very complicated. It's not just one way or two ways. Intra-specific is competition happens always within a particular species between two or more individuals of that particular species. And the reason for competition is generally for interspecific, it's when two species require the same resource, largely food. It could be habitat, it could be mates. Intraspecific, yes, intraspecific competition could largely happen for mates, and could also happen for territories, could happen for habitats, could happen for resources, right? And in fact, when a particular population grows, when it overpopulates, right, um, as a density dependent factor, intra-specific competition could kick in, right, when the density reaches a particular threshold. And um, and so that's another phenomena, or when intraspecific competition happens, when the density reaches beyond the carrying capacity. Even when the density reaches closer to the carrying capacity, you could observe certain levels of intraspecific competition. Um, and then competition for mates, I earlier mentioned that, right? Well, it is observed among intraspecific status. Interspecific competition, well, I wouldn't there are interspecific mating happening in certain cases, and on very strange circumstances there are evidence for competition, particularly when invasive species um, are trying to mate with native species. We do have some very strange instances of interspecific competition happening, and sometimes when two species that have recently split merge together in the same habitat, you could also see some evidence for competition, for interspecific competition. But largely, um, that does that is very rare, but it does happen. Okay, so I wouldn't say not observed, I would say it's very rarely observed, but can happen. Intra-specific competition is much more pronounced, much more prevalent, and largely structures community processes and ecosystem processes, right? Especially when it comes to trees, when competition happens intra-specifically or interspecifically, that could result in ecosystem level, habitat level changes. Um, yeah. So this is actually a glimpse of the data set you are looking at. Okay, and so the first column is different data coming from different groups. It's not even relevant to you. The second column is actually kind of a number identifying each and every focal pine tree. That's going to be about 45 focal pine trees and 15 trees measured with respect to that particular focal pine tree. So first you get the focal pine tree circumference in centimeters, then you get intra-specific nearest neighbor circumference, right? Meaning what? The circumference of the nearest pine tree, okay? And then you get intra-specific nearest neighbor distance. That is actually the distance between the two between the two pines, right? And then you get interspecific nearest neighbor circumference. That is the circumference of the nearest hardwood neighbor. Then you get interspecific nearest neighbor, right? That is nearest neighbor distance. That is the distance between the pine and the hardwood. Okay, and that's basically it, guys. This is the basic introduction um, to this activity, and then we will navigate on to how to do the statistical analysis, how to do the graphs, how to calculate evidence for competition, um, and then we will navigate on to doing the worksheet. Simple as that.